Dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to yet another session of our meetings at the Great Books Club. I'm broadcasting live from Bucharest. My name is Mihail Neamțu, and I'm very, very happy to welcome a great professor, a wonderful writer, and a friend of mine as well, someone who has written too many books. I can't present them all to you. Here you can see his interest in Raymond Aron, the mentor of Pierre Manon, a French Catholic philosopher, the last name I've mentioned, but of course, Raymond Aron, the arch enemy of Jean-Paul Sartre. You can see here another book by Daniel Mahoney, an edited book by him, together with Edward Erickson, about the great Solzhenitsyn. There are many more books, some of them written for a larger audience, some of them translated into French and Romanian. But tonight we are going to discuss a classic. As you know, at the Great Books Club, we typically try to bring specialists, experts who want to talk about the great classics. And tonight we are going to talk about Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky. And in particular, we are going to discuss his political thriller, published in, I hope I'm not wrong here, in something like 1871, The Demons, The Possessed or Bessie. Without further ado, but with a great joy and a great sense of intellectual pleasure, please let me welcome Professor Daniel Mahoney. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Would you like me to give some opening remarks about Dostoevsky? Is that the idea?
Absolutely, yes. And then, of course, your view on The Demons.
All right. And how long do you want me to go on for? These are crucial details.
35, 40 minutes, and then we begin the Q&A session.
40 minutes. Oh,
yes.
Did you say 40 minutes?
Yes.
Okay, very good. I believe that The Demons was written in 1871 and published in 1872, but I could be wrong, so I'll need to look that up. I know I had written a piece for in January 2022 to commemorate the 150th anniversary of the publication of Dostoevsky's Demons. I began that piece with a quotation from a 1993 address that the Russian Nobel laureate Alexander Solzhenitsyn had given at the International Academy of Philosophy in Liechtenstein. And I think it's a fitting way to begin. Many greeted the 20th as a century of elevated reason, in no way imagining the cannibalistic horrors that it would bring. Only Dostoevsky, it seems, foresaw the coming of totalitarianism. And there were certainly, of course, many 19th century thinkers who were prophetic about the coming of mass society. Burckhardt, for example, in his letter, it's Jacob Burckhardt, the Swiss classicist, has some very telling remarks about a new demagoguery and a new mass society and terrible ideological simplifications. Tocqueville famously foresaw a new form of despotism, but one that would be soft rather than hard. And there were others, but Dostoevsky saw the coming of totalitarianism with a precision and an accuracy that is truly unsurpassed. Readers of Demons may remember that, I believe in chapter 7, which is the chapter where the ideological project of the Russian revolutionary terrorists and nihilists is sketched with in some detail. A character, the theorist of this revolutionary cell in this Russian provincial town, Shagalyov, lays out a vision of the totalitarian future. Of course, he famously remarks that by beginning with premises that celebrate or entail absolute freedom, we will conclude or end up with absolute despotism. So the paradox, you might say, of modern emancipation culminating in an unprecedented form of nihilism. But Shigayov also speaks about the need for equality, this idea of a despotism in the name of equality, but where those who are equal need to be lorded over by whatever you want to call them, a revolutionary cognoscenti, a revolutionary elite. And this revolutionary elite will be dedicated to the eradication of the spiritual and cultural, and philosophical, and political wisdom of the past. And it will also be dedicated to the eradication of human greatness in all its forms. So there's a wonderful passage where it speaks about, how, Cicero's eyes have to be cut out and Shakespeare's tongue and all of this. I could read it to you, and perhaps I will a bit later. But Shigayov also talks about how we already have so many people who are unaware who belong to us. And he gives some very telling examples. The prosecutor, the juries who won't find anyone guilty, terrorists and others, for fear of feeling insufficiently progressive, teachers who refuse to teach their students right and wrong. So he sees, Dostoevsky famously denounces progressive little notions, as he calls it, that feed into not only a spiritual, cultural, and political leveling and the rise of a really new form of radical moral nihilism, but the infrastructure of a totalitarian society. So chapter 7 of the Demons is quite remarkable because Dostoevsky even predicts that if this project ever saw the light of day, in other words, if this wasn't the mad scheme of an isolated revolutionary cell in a provincial town, as Dostoevsky presents it in The Demons, but of course he has something much broader in mind. He says 100 million people will perish. And Dostoevsky saw that this project that brought together moral and political nihilism in a truly unsurpassed way, this project of radical negation, he really gathered all his imaginative and prophetic powers to confront this. What's at the heart of the modern revolutionary project? 100 million people would perish, and he was right, and perhaps many more. So I would start off by saying this about Demons: it is on the one hand an unerringly accurate diagnosis of the sickness of soul that drives this nihilistic and totalitarian temptation. But it's not merely a prophetic work about a moral and political project that has in some sense passed. It is also an account, you might say, of the spiritual pathologies, very deep-seated, that are coextensive with late modernity. So it seems to me this way, somebody like Camus, who wrote a play, a drama, Les Possédés, based on the Demons. I think Camus was obsessed with Dostoevsky's Demons because he himself was trying to overcome the sort of moral nihilism implicit in a certain version of existentialism, but he was also trying to come to terms with the revolutionary project as pure negation, as terroristic negation. And I would say today we turn to Dostoevsky not only because of his unerring accuracy about the nature of the unfolding totalitarian project, we turn to Dostoevsky not only because he saw in an unsurpassed way what was entailed in the spirit of revolutionary negation, but I think Dostoevsky is one of those great writers who gave an account of things that is more true with each passing decade. In other words, he saw a logic, he saw a spiritual temptation that remains with us regardless of the ultimate tenability of the communist or totalitarian political project. Let me say a word about the origins of the work. We know that Dostoevsky really had two books in mind. He had in mind a critique of modern atheism, and he also was inspired by reading about the revolutionary nihilist circle around Sergei Nechayev in St. Petersburg and a murder that had occurred, a murder of somebody who had tried to leave that revolutionary circle. And I'd say that the Demons brings together those two themes. Obviously, the critique of atheism, politicized, nihilistic atheism, the idea that everything is permitted, the idea not only that God is dead, but we have to kill him, with a searching exploration of a revolutionary terroristic nihilism at work. But I would add one thing. Those two themes get, well, never left behind, and they're clearly at the center of the work. They're seen in a somewhat different light because the character of Stavrogin takes a very central role in the Demons as a whole. And I don't think Dostoevsky started off with Stavrogin, this aristocratic man. Everyone looks up to him. Shatov, the neo-Slavophile, initially thinks that Stavrogin will, rejuvenate orthodoxy in Russia. Pyotr Verkovsky thinks that he's the secret leader of all the revolutionary groupuscule all over Russia. Kirillov thinks he's the forerunner of the man god, to which he theorizes and attempts to put into action through his suicide. So everyone reads into Stavrogin their own projects and possibilities. He's a very strange character, aristocratic in some decisive respects, appealing, attractive to women, a kind of natural leader. At the same time, there's something wrong about Stavrogin. He has a mutilated soul, and even all the terrible things that happen, his rapes and murders and all of that, I think it's only in that chapter at Tikhon's, where he attempts to make a spiritual confession. That's a chapter that was excluded from the initial publication of the text, but is now included in most published versions of the possessed or the devils or demons. We can use those. We can have an interesting discussion during the question and answer period of the advantages and disadvantages of all those titles. So I think the BSC, the Russian, is closest to devils or demons. Possessed, probably not the best translation, although it's the one in English that was popularized by Constance Garnett in her initial translation in the 1910s. All right, so we'll come back to Stavrogin, but he clearly, his version of almost satanic but sophisticated nihilism is really at the heart and soul of Demons, and he's somebody who seems to he's incapable of repentance. He's incapable of genuine confession. He seems to delight in that spiritual resistance to the good. And we can come back to all of this. I also would like to introduce a theme that was important in the two-part essays I wrote about demons earlier last year. And I want to come back to this. Make me come back to it if I don't sufficiently limn or sketch it. I'm going to suggest that, as in all of Dostoevsky's great works, the positive vision or alternative to the regnant nihilism is perhaps less convincing or compelling than his unerring diagnosis of the demons. And who are the demons? Or what are the demons? They're revolutionary nihilism and negation. They're politicized atheism. Dostoevsky, of course, is against atheism to core. As he wrote later in life, he came to his own affirmation of faith and orthodoxy, his own hazana, with great difficulties. But he certainly opposed atheism, but he particularly opposed this politicized atheism that aimed to, in a way, not only negate the existing social order, any social order, but to negate the human soul, to negate God's creation. There's also a very powerful critique in Demons of what Shatov calls half science. Dostoevsky, we can think of notes from the underground elsewhere. Dostoevsky is a wonderful early critic of half science, of scientism, of a wholly reductive understanding of humanity and the human condition. And of course, and this comes back to my opening statement, he is also the great prophet of an incipient totalitarianism. And he saw how that the totalitarian spirit in particular expressed limitless contempt for the primordial distinction between good and evil. This is what Solzhenitsyn would later call the ideological lie, the denial that the line between good and evil runs through every human heart and instead runs through social classes. This idea, and I think the whole Russian intelligentsia in the period from the 1840s to 1917 was dominated by this idea that the system was the problem. By the way, in America and Western Europe in the 60s, 1960s, that same thing, we've got to change the system, the idea that there's no intrinsic evil. And isn't it interesting and paradoxical that intellectuals who denied the existence or reality of intrinsic evil gave rise to a form of moral and political evil that was unprecedented in the history of humanity. Dostoevsky saw that too. So, by the way, I'm not making, you can make the point about Nietzsche, for example. He's a wonderful diagnostician, but his positive alternative, the Ubermensch, not to mention the blonde beast, is not an attractive alternative. I think Dostoevsky does limn an attractive alternative, but it's sketchy. Shatov, for example, who in some ways reflects Dostoevsky's own conviction. Shatov is a neo-Slavophile, a Slavophile. He sees through the pretensions. He sees through the terrible nihilism of the revolutionaries. He breaks with them. And they ultimately kill him because they're afraid he'll expose them. But you'll remember there's a great scene in The Demons, a kind of agon between a conversational exchange between Stavrogan and Shatov. And Shatov gives a very compelling critique of the revolutionary sect, their nihilism. But at the end of an otherwise, I think, perfect articulation of an alternative to revolutionary nihilism, he says, well, every people has its own tablet of good and evil. And Stavrogan says to him, well, do you believe in God? And Shatov says, well, I will believe in God, right? And I suggest that there's some Shatov in Dostoevsky and some Dostoevsky in Shatov. meaning Shatov wants to believe, and yet his Slavophilism, if we can put it that way, seems to be more pronounced than what I would call authentic Christianity. And Shatov is largely an attractive figure, but he's not an altogether compelling figure for some reasons I've found. I think the same thing could be said about Brothers Karamazov, the Jesus of the Grand Inquisitor. He doesn't say anything. He's very passive. The only act he does during the parable is, which after all is a tale told by Ivan, and many people miss that. It's Ivan's account of the Grand Inquisitor. But, is Jesus, the historical Jesus, the Trinitarian Jesus, the Son of God, quite as passive as the Jesus of the Grand Inquisitor? Alyosha is the best of the brothers, but he's young and he's meek. And again, Father Zosima, I think in some ways, the last part of Brothers Karamazov, the account of Father Zosima, whose body, of course, deteriorates, and as a starets, body isn't supposed to. But he too provides, I think, a beautiful spiritual alternative to the moral and political nihilism of Ivan Karamazov. And yet, I think any reader of Brothers Karamazov would have to say that Ivan Karamazov is a more memorable and powerful, not admirable, figure than Father Zosima. So I'm trying to make a point that, not to, like Nietzsche, where the positive alternative is to be avoided, but with Dostoevsky, I don't think Dostoevsky was ever completely successful in limning or sketching a positive alternative. Some of that, I think, has to do with the ambiguity of his own faith. He came to that Hosanna with great and arduous difficulty. Part of it, there's the famous letter from 1841 to Madame Feodorovna, where he says, well, if if he had to choose between the truth and Christ, he would choose Christ. Well, I mean, I think we choose Christ because Christ is the truth. Now, I think Dostoevsky knew that too, but there's a romantic dimension to his Christianity. There is a Slavophile dimension to his Christianity. I don't think they're the dominant or only notes, but his positive alternative is complicated and perhaps a work in very high progress, if I can put it that way. All right.
Thank you, Daniel. I would like to, if you don't mind, just to quickly make a few remarks,
Sure.
and just say that we very much liked your very clarifying introduction, but I also think it would be worth looking at the tension between the Father and the Son. Of course, this is a very Hegelian dialectic, so to speak. The Father, who is a liberal progressive, he's the image of Herzen, maybe, is Stepan Trofimovich, and the son, Piotr, who is the radical. Now, of course, there is a late conversion in the life of Stepan,
Yes.
who gets to meet a very simple lady at the end of his life who is selling Bibles, okay? And he's beginning to read the Bible together with this woman, and gradually he's melting down, he's becoming more repentful, and his heart is broken. And obviously this is a very interesting contrast. So you have the intellectual, the university professor, who actually never made it to the university, so to speak. He was more of a Madame Bovary type. And then on the other hand, you have the simple woman who is an active Christian, in the sense that she's not just believing the Bible, but she's also selling the books. But the question is, why do you think for Dostoevsky, the kind of liberalism, classical liberalism, so to speak, espoused by Herzen and by the 1845, 1848 generation, and I'm including here perhaps other liberals like Chadaev, not just Herzen, but also Belensky. Why do you think in such a poor country like Russia, liberalism as a political experiment failed. Because in a sense, we can't talk about Dostoevsky today without looking at the serial failures of the Russian society, in a sense, just in a sense, when it comes to adopting Western institutions. And why is that liberalism, both from a political and theological perspective, in Dostoevsky's writings, is presented as a kind of limited and failed experiment?
Well, that's a great question. I was going to get to the Verkhovenskys because the dialectic between Stepan and Pyotr is really at the center, certainly of the political and moral drama of the book. I would say this, I'm not sure I would use the term classical liberalism to describe Russian liberalism, and I'll tell you why. As Dostoevsky powerfully notes in almost all of his writings, but particularly the Demons, these were liberals who saw no enemies to the left. And that's why there's a wonderful exchange between Stepan and Pyotr in the middle of the book where Stepan is trying to figure out, his son, Pyotr, has recently returned to town. He's a very destructive presence. It's immediately felt by all, but he brings, the governess. I mean, we're talking about liberal dupes. Yulia von Lemke is this, all these provincial gentlemen and gentlewomen show up at these discussion groups, and they're thrilling to these absolutely insane and terroristic and nihilistic and totalitarian things that Shagalyov and Pyotr Verkhovsky say. And, and the governor, Andrei Antonovich von Lemke, says, he's thinking this to himself, and the narrator fills us in, but he says, well, I'm like the Tory to the Whigs, as if these destructive nihilistic terrorists are Whigs who just need a little sense of Tory authority and responsibility. And so it's just remarkable. So whatever that was, that inability to acknowledge nihilism and totalitarianism, what there are, I probably wouldn't give it the name classical liberalism, but it was Russian liberalism. Solzhenitsyn says in his Red Wheel that the only real liberal in Russia was Pyotr Stolypin. He wanted a constitutional order that was friendly to religion, that promoted social and political progress without nihilistic revolutionary. The cadets, the ruling party, the constitutional Democrats, who were certainly part of the provisional government and part of the February Revolution and the liberal opposition before 1917 in the Duma, they never condemned terrorism. Milyukov, who became foreign minister in the provisional government, said, if we condemn terrorism, it would be the end of the party. What kind of liberals refuse to condemn indiscriminate terrorism? Namely, Russian liberals, and the kind of liberalism that Dostoevsky describes and highlights and condemns in Demons. So I don't think Dostoevsky's account of Russian liberalism is particularly a caricature. And let me talk some more about, and by the way, I'm glad you brought up the conversion of Stepan. We don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves, but a reader of literature might ask, how believable is it that Stepan, this soft, indulgent, liberal, by the way, not only did he not get a real education, but he claims he was expelled to the provinces because he posed a terrible intellectual threat to the Tsarist regime. I don't think anyone in Moscow or Petersburg had heard of Stepan Verkhovensky, but that's part of the charm too. And of course, he's taken under the wings by Stavrogin's mother, who is a former owner of serfs who also loves entertaining, flirting with progressive ideas without taking them very seriously. But in any case, there's a scene in chapter 4 of Demons. It's called All in Expectation, at least in the translation that I'm using, which is the Piver and Volkonsky The two discuss Nikolai Chernyshevsky's earlier extremist revolutionary tract, What is to be Done? And you'll remember that the title and also the destructive revolutionary nihilism advocated by Chernyshevsky would be freely adopted by Lenin himself. So Stepan tells us that he had studied What is to be Done to find out where this strange destructiveness, embodied by his very son, had come from. So it's very interesting. Stepan sort of accepts the ideas that are in the air, but he's disturbed by their consequences. And this is the most revealing comment that he makes to his son. He says, "I agree that the author's basic idea is correct, but so much more horrible for that." Well, if you begin that the basic idea of the Russian radicals are correct, that the world has to be transformed in a radical and systematic way, that the old verities, God, country, the very basis of the monarchy, everything in Russia has to be overturned. It's very hard to say, I accept the ideas, but I refuse the means that are necessary to that task. And Pyotr points that out to his father. You can't affirm the basic truth of the ideas in that turgid and nihilistic catechism and then say to your son, well, what are you doing? And, so Stepan says the ideas have become perverted, distorted, and mutilated. But I think in this case, Dostoevsky, well, it's true, Stepan is not a bad man. He's a weak man. He's under the thumb of Vera. He's incoherent spiritually and politically, but he's decent. And after the fire, after the conflagration, after the murders, and at the time of his conversion, boy, it's really striking. He speaks a lot of French during his conversion. He's out of it, and half the dialogue is in French. I was very struck on rereading the book recently. But anyway, he says, and this is a direct response, in a way, to Shigayov. He says, he talks about Shakespeare and Raphael and how the wisdom and beauty of their works far transcends any political or revolutionary cause. In other words, at the time of his conversion, after this deadly revolution and murderous revolutionary conflagration, the terrible fire after the ball for the governesses that Mrs. von Lemke had sponsored, Stepan repudiates the basic idea of the revolutionary catechism. So he's really made a conversion, a genuine conversion. He repudiates his milquetoast middle way, you might say. But
he repudiates the culture of repudiation.
He does.
In the words of
that affirmation of Shakespeare and Raphael could be made by any of us, or Roger Scruton, or anyone who rejects the subordination of literary, philosophical, theological truth to a social cause or political movement. So that is, that proclamation of his fidelity to beauty is, he says, even the freeing of the serfs. Was anything more important for Russian progressives than the freeing of the serfs? And yet the truth and beauty inherent in the works of Shakespeare and Raphael are more important. And yes, there's a figure in this book. You brought up Gertzen. There's a figure in this book who's based on him, and he's represented very likably. I think Dostoevsky had the number on these guys. He saw that the liberals wanted to hold on, you might say, parasitically or residually to some of the old virtues, a certain gentlemanliness and decor and learning for its own sake. And yet they had no really persuasive retort to the revolutionaries. And I mentioned before the cadets' inability and unwillingness to condemn revolutionary terror. We're talking about, 10,000 people who were, this is after Dostoevsky's time, but just between 1905 and 1908, when Stolypin put down the terrorist movement, something like 10,000 people were murdered indiscriminately, right? A liberal party or liberal and progressive intellectuals who refuse to condemn those kinds of actions have given up the game, So it's interesting. Stepan, in his sort of in his fevered statements that accompany his conversion, he commits himself, and I like this quote, to fighting the big and little demons that have accumulated in our great and dear sick man Russia. Boy, it couldn't be said any better. Stepan, and again, I raise the question of its literary believability, because the Stepan we've known for 600 pages, it's hard to imagine that he could have such absolute clarity about the disease, the pathologies, the confronting Russia. But he says these are insane and raging, right? That's exactly Dostoevsky's point. And it's this context, remember, in the conversion scene, that Stepan asked to have the account of the Gadarene swine read to him. And that's Luke 8:32-36. That's also one of the two epigrams to the book. So that's where I think Constance Garnett, her title, possessed, and in some French editions is possédé. I think it comes from this idea that the whole class of people, including maybe these indulgent liberals, have been possessed by a kind of Satanism, by the spirit of modern destructive ideology. And of course, we all know that the Gadarene swine, Jesus gets rid of the demons by sending them into the pigs that go off the cliff, right? And that's a kind of metaphor for the destruction. Quote, this is one little provincial town. But remember, Piotr thinks, Verkovensky thinks, that there are hundreds of such cells all over Russia. And you could say, no, this was a singular revolutionary cell in the context of Dostoevsky's novel. But there were, in effect, cells of demons all over Russia. Some active and terroristic from the people's will to later social revolutionaries, but others just intellectual cells. And then, of course, the sort of liberals who as I said, who are motivated by this philosophy, pas d'ennemi à gauche. Just a few years after the publication of Demons, the police chief in Petersburg, Trepov, was murdered by the people's will. And in a very famous case of jury nullification, the Russians always talked about society, as opposed to the regime or the court or the monarchy. The members of civil society, middle class, upper class people from Petersburg found him not guilty. Found Verzaselich, a revolutionary, actually had a very interesting correspondence with Karl Marx, who was sometimes for terrorism. He was a bit more of a voluntarist than his official philosophy of history might suggest. But anyway, everyone saw Verzaselich do it. She was guilty of sin, and yet she was found not guilty by a group of progressive members of society. That's the same mentality that inspired the early Stepan, that inspired Gertsen, that inspired the Cadet Party in the years leading up to 1917.
Dan, perhaps we should also tell our colleagues and friends that this book, The Demons, was supposed to be read by Lenin. Somebody offered him in 1872 to offer the novel. He thought this is a piece of reactionary literature not worth reading. Maybe a conversion of Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov would have spared us from the horrors of the Bolshevik Revolution. But since you've mentioned the chapter where Piotr talks about the culture of repudiation, in the words of Roger.
You want me to read some of those quotes?
Please do. Please do.
Okay. So I would say at the heart of the demons, and certainly the reason why the book has been of immense practical interest, is this the revolutionary program of the nihilists themselves. And that was what I was talking about before. As a diagnostician, as a phenomenologist of moral nihilism and terroristic revolution, Dostoevsky is unsurpassed. So Piotr champions, as I mentioned before, the revolutionary program of the cell's theorist, Shagalyov. Now, revolutionary theorist who really presents an ideology of the most fanatical kind. And it's very precise, down to the smallest details. He proclaims, Piotr Verkovensky says that, it's a funny line, a darkly funny line. He says, Shagalyov has invented equality. Well, obviously, the idea of equality in a strict sense wasn't invented by Shagalyov, but this version of equality was invented by Shagalyov. And the goal, as Dostoevsky tells us, is nothing less than a paradise on earth. And again, this is Verkovensky's summary of Shagalyov's theorizing. One that will self-consciously create equality in slavery. You may remember Tocqueville in his major political writings creates an alternative between equality and liberty and equality and servitude, which the revolutionary left offers. But here, Tocqueville, of course, is condemning equality in slavery as the ultimate dehumanization of the human race. But not so Shagalyov or Verkovensky. So true freedom, Shagalyov insists, can only be found in perfect despotism. And so in a way, I think Dostoevsky's pointing out that this is no ordinary run-of-the-mill authoritarianism, autocracy, or despotism. This isn't the classical tyrant described by Montesquieu or in Book 5 of Aristotle's Politics. No, this is a modern ideological project. Joseph de Maistre would not hesitate to call it satanic. And certainly everything in this book suggests that Dostoevsky too thought this enterprise was satanic. Why? Because everything must be leveled, and that means high human aspiration, whether spiritual or intellectual, because those inequalities and qualities of soul that are given by nature or God give rise to inequalities, to dreaded inequalities. So any manifestation of human greatness, even the highest and most noble aspirations of the human soul, must be crushed and beaten out of human beings. And to come back to a line I had alluded to at the beginning of my talk, slaves, Verkovensky tells us, citing the theory of Shagalyov, they need rulers, and true egalitarianism demands despotism of an unprecedented variety. So this is demonism, and it knows no limits. Because the higher abilities cannot be tolerated, nobility, and listen to these words, they must be banished or executed. Executed. That might have something to do with the 100 million corpses that Dostoevsky predicts. So this is a paradise turned nightmare where Cicero's tongue is cut off, Copernicus' eyes put out, and Shakespeare is stoned. This, Verkovensky tells us, is Shagalyism. So the point is authentic freedom and equality, or emancipation and equality according to the revolutionaries is impossible without a truly inhuman and unprecedented kind of despotism. And just one other point in the next chapter, chapter 8, which is entitled Ivan the Tsarevich, Verkovensky comes back and this is where he chronicles all the soft utopians. It's a phrase of Reinhold Niebuhr, but it's really what Dostoevsky has in mind when he's talking about the Russian pseudo liberals. He says they, in their own way and without fully knowing it, they've already succumbed to moral nihilism and political insanity. The children have been taught by their teachers to laugh at God. Lawyers, as I said before, shamelessly defend the deeds of murderers for fear of being insufficiently progressive. Here's a good one. Schoolboys who kill just to see how it feels. Academics who defend murder as either a sign of insanity or material necessity, but never of evil. That's a point I got to earlier. The Russian liberals were already complicit in this idea that there was no intrinsic evil in the human condition of the human soul, and that when people do terrible things, they are acting out of necessity, causal necessity, moral necessity, societal necessity. So these are all ours, Piotr says. They're fellow travelers of totalitarian revolution and moral nihilism, even if they don't know that they unofficially belong to the party of nihilism. They're already drunk with ideology, and Piotr says, and in due time, they will get even drunker. And again, what are they already drunk with? The cult of revolution, of half science or scientism, this angry atheism. Edmund Burke famously said the atheists of old, like the Epicureans, were a pretty mild lot. You know, they went to their garden. They didn't dream of a whole societies that were atheistic. Not so this monstrous politicized atheism. And again, and this is a great point of connection, as I said before, between Dostoevsky and Solzhenitsyn. The party of nihilism has contempt for all permanent standards and all solid foundations for the indispensable distinction between good and evil. I'll just end by saying this is the contemporaneity of the book. Is not only is the book an unerring prediction, a prophetic unfolding of the murderous totalitarian, mendacious totalitarianism of the 20th century, but I would argue that the soft utopians are no longer so soft, that the party of nihilism is much more numerous, much more aggressive, much more committed to what Mihai had called, following the late, great Roger Scruton, the culture of repudiation, of pure negation. And in some sense, I have a feeling that this version of the nihilist project is succeeding to a greater extent than the old totalitarianism succeeded, because the old totalitarianism, in a way, it certainly had its fellow travelers and its true believers, but its cruelty and barbarism and mendacity was there for all to see. And the party of nihilism today is it controls what Gramsci called the commanding heights of society, and it is increasingly coercive. It is increasingly punitive, and it turns out to be just as totalitarian in its own way as the more brutal and murderous 20th century manifestation of political and moral nihilism. So I'll end on that note, but I think we covered many essential things. I will add that this book is literally inexhaustible, and in that there are literary dimensions of it that it's a big baggy book in a way, because it's some part political pamphlet, some part, it's a strange work for a work of literature. and yet it holds together, and it has a very powerful effect on those who are open to its message.
Thank you so much. We already have some. Thank you very much, Professor Mahoney. Once again, we are talking right now to the greatest, I would say, in the English-speaking world, to the greatest expert on Solzhenitsyn. Please make sure that you are going to read some of his great exegesis on Solzhenitsyn, available also in Romanian. There's another book I would recommend by a classical liberal, I should say, Isaiah Berlin, Russian Thinkers, is a good book that explains very much the political context in which the radicals of the 1860s appeared. But because you belong to the Anglo American sphere, Dan Mahoney, I just want to make a very brief comment, and then we'll take the questions. Namely that a Scottish missionary decided in the 1830s and in the 1840s to talk to Tsar Nikolai I about the establishment of a Bible society in Russia, and the Tsar agreed with this. So for the first time, there was a translation made available in the vernacular Russian by a Scottish missionary, funded both by the British Empire and by the Russian Empire. And when he was 29 years old, when Dostoevsky was in prison, essentially in Siberia, it was rather cold. It was minus 40 degrees Celsius. He was traveling from Petersburg, the famous prison of St. Paul and Peter, to Tobolsk. And in Tobolsk, he gets to see a widow, the widow of a Decembrist officer who was killed probably by Nikolai I. And so this lady was very much impressed with Dostoevsky. He was regarded as a genius, as you know, from the age of 24. He was very much famous, made famous by Belensky. He was given a Bible produced by some British missionaries, and in the Bible there was a 10 rubles banknote, and that Bible in Siberia was actually the instrument that converted him to Christianity in a more, I would say, orthodox manner, not a romantic approach to Jesus, but more of a kind of orthodox approach. And the most quoted passage, or rather gospel, from the Bible, from the New Testament in Dostoevsky, is the Gospel of John. And this was just a side remark for a celebration of this ecumenical spirit, which in those days was rather present all across Europe. Now we have a question from a colleague of ours called Laura, and she's asking, she's a lawyer herself, and then perhaps other friends, Troy, Christian, Estera, who knows, maybe others will ask you other questions. The question is, do you believe Russia today will ever be respected in the light of the recent events? Do you think we can speak of demons possessing the Russian society today in the same way they were present in the 19th century?
Oh, I don't want to spend too much time with that. I think there's a tendency today to, among many, to blame the whole Soviet enterprise on eternal Russia and on this inability of Russia to reform. And some of that in the West, you have to understand. In the West today, there are the neoconservative types who never believed anything happened after 1990, who always saw Russia in some geopolitical sense, or even in that Richard Pipe sense, with some kind of patriarchal despotism as the enemy. There are certainly many on the American and European left who don't like Russia because on many cultural and religious issues, it's to the right of us. I have in mind, the LGBTQ ideology, which is destroying American youth and schools. We have schools in America where 85% of the students identify as transgendered and that kind of thing. I think post-communist Russia is much more of a mixed bag than a lot of people realize. I think Putin's been in power for way too long. The sad part is it's not clear. I mean, Putin was quite popular in the first 5 or 8 years of his presidency because the Russian 1990s, with the help of Western experts and economists, were so disastrous. And in a way, people started getting their bills again, and the country recovered some self-respect, and there were some intellectual and even some political freedoms. But the regime has certainly become more brutal and authoritarian. But I fault Putin above all for not staying in power too long, because he crowded out the possibility of the development of meaningful political life. You can have meaningful political life in a country without full-scale democracy, but I know many Russians, and I don't believe the Russian soul is essentially diseased. And to quote Charles de Gaulle, the future lasts a long time. So I don't share the Polish view of Russia, which I find a bit hysterical, that all Russians are bad. And I remember Ryszard Legutko, the Polish writer, has written some good books. He wrote a very good book on totalitarian trends in free societies, The Demon in Democracy. But he reviewed Solzhenitsyn's Between Two Millstones, Volume 1, the account of his first 4 or 5 years in the West. And he said, well, Solzhenitsyn's an admirable man. There's much to admire, but I only have one problem with it. He loves Russia. Well, you can't blame Russia. Solzhenitsyn called for Russia to look inward and reject empire and reject lies and rejuvenate the Orthodox tradition. And, there are some, especially in the West and some in Poland and elsewhere, who just think Russia is coextensive with pathology. I don't want to go that far.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Professor Mahoney. Who else would like to take the opportunity? Anka, okay. Typically, we would like to see the camera on so that Professor Mahoney can also see you.
That's right. I don't want to be speaking. Yeah, I see you. I see you through a little bit of a glass darkly, but I do see you.
A Pauline image.
And by the way, if I use that Pauline image to my students, I think about 80% of them would think I invented it. Anka?
Hey, can you turn on the mic? Okay, Anka? It's off.
Oh, I was speaking to myself. So hello, everyone, and I'm really glad to hear the professor. I have many questions for him. I, as always, forgot the name.
Professor Mahoney.
Okay.
Mahoney is an Irish name, except if we were in Ireland. If I were in, my ancestors are all Irish, but if we were in Ireland, it would be pronounced Mahoney.
Mahoney.
I've gone to Ireland a few times, and when I say I'm Daniel Mahoney, they say, no, you're Mahoney, but we don't talk that way in America. So anyway, you didn't need to know that. But
I was in Ireland, and I know that. Yes, I have two questions, but the first one, which is like more important for me, is when I captured you saying that there is no link between the theological feelings or sorts of, I'm not sure exactly how to express this, and between the theological or spiritual maybe and the social and political. There is no link. I mean, you cannot subordinate to the social and political. But now I'm going to the Bible, and I know that we were, especially in the Old Testament, we were taught that we have to subordinate to the great authority, which can be the king, which can be the prime minister nowadays. And that was my first question.
Well, I mean, there's a difference between Christianity and Judaism. Judaism, well, by the way, kingship comes later. When God sort of reluctantly gives Israel their kings, it's said that now they're like all the other nations. Maybe they weren't supposed to be like all the other nations. They were supposed to be a singular nation with this covenant or alliance with God. But no, I mean, Judaism is provides a fundamental law.
Sorry to interrupt, but there's the Old Testament, which is for all the Christians. I'm not sure I'm speaking about some passages from the Old Testament, which is for Christians as well, where you have to subordinate
It's
to
Romans 13. The New Testament speaks about a mandatory sort of subordination of Christians under the Caesar.
Yeah,
But that's
yeah,
Romans 13.
but you know, but Acts 5 or 6 also says obey God rather than man. There's tension in the New Testament's account of the relationship of human beings to political authority. I do think Romans 13 is authoritative. I don't think I think the New Testament does not have a expressly political teaching in the sense of a developed one, but Romans 13 does suggest that we are obliged to obey the civil authorities whose authority and legitimacy comes from God. On the other hand, um, I think this is at the root of Christian opposition to totalitarianism. There's some things we can't do. And again, to come back to the words of Peter in Acts, we can't obey man rather than God. We certainly can't accept the mixture of half science, mendacity, atheism, murder, tyranny that uh, made up 20th century totalitarianism. So I think one reason an author like Solzhenitsyn would say old fashioned autocracy did not pose a terrible spiritual challenge for Christians because it didn't ask us to sell our souls. It didn't ask us to commit out and out idolatry. It didn't ask it asked for obedience in a limited realm. But whenever political authority asks us to worship what cannot and should not be worshiped, when it asks us to live by systematic lies, when I quote Solzhenitsyn again from the Gulag Archipelago, when cruelty and betrayal and lies become forms of existence, I think we're obliged to say no. Now that's a question of prudence. How we say no. Is that open